It all started the moment I parked my truck at the edge of the gravel drive and looked across the lake that shimmered in the morning light. The same lake I had dreamed about since I was a boy. The same lake where I had promised myself I would one day own a piece of land no matter what it took. And now, standing there with the keys to the cabin in my hand, I thought nothing could sour the moment, but I was wrong. Because the very first person to approach me was Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, striding toward me like she owned the shoreline, her voice shrill as she announced, "You can't just move in here without approval." I had barely set one boot on the porch step before she was demanding paperwork. Her eyes narrowing at my truck, my bags, the American flag folded on the dashboard, and though I tried to be polite, explaining I had already purchased the property, outright she waved me off, insisting that every home, even cabins, had to comply with community standards. She was joined by 2 board members who hovered behind her like shadows, scribbling in little pads as though my existence itself was a violation. And I felt my temper flare, though I reminded myself that this was the kind of fight I had prepared. 4. I told her calmly that this was not HOA land, that my deed stretched back 150 years, grandfathered before the HOA ever formed, but she scoffed, claiming her authority extended to any property visible from the lake. My wife Emily came out onto the porch carrying a box, her face lighting up until she noticed the crowd, her smile fading as Karen immediately turned her attention on her, demanding she remove the potted plants she had set on the railing because they clashed with community aesthetics. I saw Emily's jaw tighten, but before she could speak, I stepped down onto the gravel and leveled my eyes with Karen's, telling her plainly that she had no jurisdiction here, no claim, and no say. She laughed, the kind of laugh that isn't amusement but threat, and said, "We'll see about that." That night, long after we had carried the last of the boxes inside and lit a fire in the old stone hearth, Emily asked if I thought they would really come back, and I told her yes. Because people like Karen never stopped at the first confrontation. They always came harder the second time. And I was right, because the very next morning, just as the sun burned the mist off the lake, we heard the crunch of tires on the gravel again, but this time it wasn't Karen alone. It was a caravan of SUVs, men and women in polos with clipboards, stepping out like they were conducting an inspection, and Karen at the front with a megaphone, announcing to the empty air that my cabin was subject to compliance review. I walked out onto the porch, coffee mug in hand, and asked them what exactly they were doing. Karen smirked and said they were documenting violations, pointing at my split rail fence, my firewood stacked by the shed, even the flagpole I had just sunk into the ground. Emily joined me, her arms crossed, and I could feel her anger radiating, but I put a hand on her arm to keep her steady, because I knew this was just the beginning. They snapped photos, wrote notes, and finally handed me a thick envelope stuffed with papers that claimed I owed $20,000 in fines, payable within 30 days. I laughed in her face, the sound sharp and hard, and said, "You'll never see a dime." Karen's eyes flashed, and she hissed, "Then you'll see what happens when you defy us." As they drove away, dust rising behind their tires, I looked at Emily and told her this was the fight we had been expecting. That night, I sat at the old oak table, with the envelope spread out before me, reading every word, and it was just as I thought, completely fabricated authority. Citing rules that didn't exist, bylaws that held no weight over land never ceded to their HOA. But I also knew their power wasn't in the legality. It was in intimidation, in harassment, in wearing people down until they gave up. I wasn't about to give up. The next few days were a storm of phone calls, letters, and unannounced visits. Karen showing up with different board members each time, demanding access to the property, threatening to cut utilities, even hinting at law enforcement. Emily grew, more frustrated, pacing the cabin, asking how far they could push before the law stepped in. I told her the truth, they would push as far as we let them. That's when I started documenting everything. Every visit, every threat, every bogus. Paper shoved into my hands. I set up cameras around the cabin, hidden and obvious, making sure every angle of the yard was covered. And it didn't take long for those cameras to capture exactly what I expected. Karen and her cronies sneaking around at night, measuring, photographing, trying to find leverage. When I confronted her the next day with still images in my hand, She turned pale for just a second before regaining her composure and sneering, "You think you're clever? You won't last here?" But I knew then that I had her, because the one thing bullies hate more than resistance is exposure. And I was about to shine a light so bright she wouldn't have anywhere left to hide. That was the day I made my decision, not just to fight her, but to turn the fight back on her, to make her regret ever stepping foot on my land. And as I stood on the porch that evening with the fireflies rising over the water and Emily at my side, I swore that whatever it took, I was going to win this war. The next morning I woke before dawn. The cabin still wrapped in shadows and the lake outside barely catching the first streaks of pink light. And as I sipped my coffee, I felt the weight of what had begun, knowing Karen and her HOA weren't going to let this go quietly, knowing their kind thrived on persistence and intimidation, but also feeling a steady fire inside me that had only grown since that first confrontation. Emily stirred awake and joined me on the porch, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders, asking softly if I thought they'd try something new today. And I told her I didn't think they would because that was how they operated, always pushing, always testing boundaries until someone broke. And just as I said it, the crunch of gravel came again, this time slower, deliberate. And when I stepped off the porch, I saw Karen's sedan glide to a stop, her window rolling down with that same sneer plastered on her face. She didn't even get out, just waved another paper in the air, shouting that fines had doubled overnight due to non-compliance, and if I refused to pay, liens would be placed against my cabin. I walked up to her window, leaned down so we were eye to eye, and said calmly, "Try it." Her face twisted, a flash of rage breaking through her mask. And she drove off so quickly the tires spat gravel across the yard. Emily looked worried, but I shook my head and told her that Karen was only escalating because she was losing control. Later that afternoon, I drove into town to meet with an attorney, a seasoned man named Richard who had dealt with HOA harassment cases before, and when I handed him the stack of bogus papers Karen had given me, he chuckled dryly, flipping through them and shaking his head. "Not worth the paper it's printed on," he said, explaining that the HOA had no jurisdiction over my land, and their attempts to levy fines or liens were baseless. But he warned me too, they'll try to make your life hell anyway. Count on people giving up before it ever gets to court. I told him giving up wasn't in my nature, and he smiled, promising to draft a cesandesis to send to Karen by week's end. Driving back to the cabin, I felt a sense of resolve settle deeper into me, but I also knew Karen wouldn't wait around for paperwork. Sure enough, when I pulled into the drive, I saw her standing with 2 board members near the fence line, pointing toward my yard as if conducting a tour, her voice carrying across the open air about unsightly conditions and safety hazards. I parked the truck and strode over, asking if trespassing was part of her HOA handbook now. She turned, lips curling into a mock smile, and said, "We're simply exercising oversight. Our community deserves standards." I laughed, telling her again this wasn't her community, and when she tried to argue, I pulled out my phone, showing her the footage of her and the others sneaking onto my land the night before. The board members paled, one muttering something about leaving, but Karen snapped at them to stay, her authority fraying as the evidence hung between us. "You wouldn't dare show that to anyone," she hissed. And I told her she should pray I didn't. They left soon after, and Emily came out with a look of mixed pride and worry, asking how much longer this would drag on, and I told her as long as it took, because bullies never stopped on their own, they had to be forced to. That night, I lay awake listening to the lake's gentle lapping, my mind turning over strategies, ways to protect our home, ways to turn Karen's obsession against her. The cameras were already working, but I added motion lights reinforced the locks and kept a detailed journal of every incident, every word, every threat. A pattern was forming. Karen always struck hardest after a public embarrassment, always tried to reassert control by doubling down, and I knew it was only a matter of time before she tried something bigger. The following week confirmed it. Came home one afternoon to find a county inspector's truck parked in my drive. Karen standing nearby with her arms crossed, a smug grin on her face. The inspector introduced himself politely, saying he had received anonymous complaints about unpermitted structures on the property. I gestured toward the cabin, explaining it had stood for over a century, grandfathered and documented, and he admitted quickly that he saw no issues. Karen's grin faltered, but she tried to press, asking about the fence, the flagpole, the shed. The inspector humored her, checked them all, then shrugged, telling her everything was compliant. I thanked him, shook his hand, and watched him leave, but the look on Karen's face was pure venom. "You won't win," she spat, before storming off with her board members scurrying behind. Emily hugged me that night, whispering she hated living in constant tension, and I promised her it wouldn't last forever, though I knew in my gut that Karen was far from done. She would come back harder, and I needed to be ready, so I started thinking not just about defense, but offense. About how to corner her with her own arrogance, how to let her dig a hole so deep she couldn't climb out. The seed of a plan formed. As I sat on the porch, watching the moonrise over the lake, the cool night air settling over the water, and I knew that the next move wouldn't be hers alone, I would make sure of it. The following days passed with an uneasy calm, as if the lake itself was holding its breath. But I knew Karen well enough by then to understand it wasn't peace. Only the pause before her next storm, and sure enough, it came that Friday evening. Just as Emily and I were sitting down to dinner, the sudden glare of headlights swept across the cabin windows, and the rumble of multiple engines shook the gravel drive. And when I stepped outside, I counted 3 SUVs pulling up, each one disgorging. Men and women in polo shirts carrying binders and cameras, Karen striding at the front like a general leading an army. Emily stood behind me, tense, while I walked down the steps to meet them head-on, asking what circus they thought they were running this time. Karen raised her chin, declaring that my property was officially condemned for safety violations, and one of the men began stapling a bright orange notice to my fence post. I ripped it down before he could finish, crumpling it in my fist and tossing it at Karen's feet, telling her she was trespassing, and if she didn't leave immediately, I'd have the sheriff out here. She smirked and said, "Go ahead, call him. He's one of ours." That rattled me for just a second, but I didn't let it show, instead pulling out my phone and starting to film. The moment the red light blinked, Karen's entourage faltered, shifting nervously. Though she tried to hold her composure, barking that I couldn't record them without consent, I told her to look up state law, and when she realized I knew exactly what I was doing, she snapped for everyone to retreat. They filed back into their SUVs, and as they sped off into the night, I knew she would not stop there. She was building to something bigger, something she thought would break us once and for all. Emily gripped my arm, her voice trembling as she asked how much more we could take. And I pulled her close, whispering that no matter how ugly it got, we weren't going anywhere. That weekend I met again with Richard, handing him the video and the crumpled orange notice, and his frown deepened as he scanned the details. "They're escalating into outright fraud," he said, promising to file for an injunction, but warning it could take time. "She'd try to outpace us, overwhelm you with harassment before the court catches up." Driving home, I felt the knot in my chest tighten. But I also felt a grim sort of resolve, because if Karen wanted a war, I was done playing defense. I would start fighting on my terms. The chance came sooner than I expected. On Monday morning, just after dawn, Emily shook me awake with panic in her voice, pulling me toward the window. Outside, a tow truck idled in the yard, its driver already hooking chains to my truck. Karen stood nearby, arms folded, waving a sheet of paper that she claimed was an order for removal of non-compliant vehicles. I stormed outside, demanding he unhook immediately, and when the driver hesitated, mumbling that he was just following instructions, I told him flatly that if he touched my truck again, I'd have him arrested for theft. He glanced at Karen, then at me, and something in my tone must have convinced him because he dropped the chains and drove off, leaving her screaming in the dust. Emily clapped a hand to her mouth, half in shock, half in relief, and I told her this was proof Karen was getting desperate. That night, as the fire crackled in the hearth, I laid out my plan. I would use every shred of evidence I had been collecting to not just defend myself, but to expose her corruption publicly. Make sure every neighbor, Every board member, every official in the county saw exactly what she was doing. Emily nodded, her eyes shining with both fear and admiration. And together we prepared binders of documents, photographs, video clips, and logs. The next community meeting was scheduled for Wednesday night at the HOA's head office, and I decided that would be the battlefield where I drew the line. When the night came, Emily and I walked into the office carrying our binders, and the room fell silent as Karen's eyes locked on us. She tried to laugh, tried to brush it off. But when I began laying out photo after photo of her trespassing, video after video of her harassment, copies of fabricated fines and bogus notices, the room shifted. Board members who had once stood at her back now glanced at one another uneasily, some whispering, some shaking their heads. Karen tried to interrupt, her voice rising, but I kept talking, louder, clearer, until there was no mistaking the truth. "This is abuse," I said firmly. "This is fraud. This is going to stop." The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the scrape of a chair as one board member stood, then another, distancing themselves from her. Karen's face was crimson, her voice cracking as she shouted that I was lying, that I had forged evidence. But no one believed her anymore. Emily squeezed my hand under the table, and in that moment I knew we had shifted the ground beneath Karen's feet. She wasn't defeated yet, but she was cornered, and people like her only got more dangerous when they realized their power was slipping away. The meeting ended in chaos, Karen storming out with her face twisted in fury while the board members scattered in different directions, some avoiding my eyes, others quietly nodding in acknowledgement of what I had presented. And as Emily and I walked back to the truck that night under the buzzing streetlights, I felt a strange mixture of triumph and anticipation, because while we had exposed her lies, I knew Karen wasn't the type to simply retreat and lick her wounds. She was the type to retaliate, to dig deeper and lash out harder than before. Emily gripped my arm tightly as we drove back toward the cabin, her voice low and anxious, asking if I thought she might try something violent. And though I wanted to reassure her completely, I told her honestly that it was a possibility, but that we had prepared ourselves for it. When we got home, the air felt thicker, the silence of the lake less peaceful than usual, and I spent half the night walking the perimeter with a flashlight, checking the locks and cameras again and again. Just before dawn, I finally dozed off in the armchair by the fire, only to be jolted awake by a pounding on the door. Emily rushed from the bedroom, and when I opened the door, two county deputies stood there, stern-faced, holding a paper Karen had evidently filed claiming we were conducting illegal construction on the property. I read it quickly, noting the lack of any legitimate signature or permit number, and told them calmly that it was fabricated. They looked at one another, clearly uncomfortable, and admitted they had received several complaints but found nothing suspicious on their drive up. Emily invited them in, offering coffee, and as they sat down I laid out the stack of evidence I had been building, explaining the entire harassment campaign Karen had orchestrated. They listened carefully, flipping through photos and documents, and by the time they left, their tone had changed from suspicion to sympathy. One of them promising to make a note in their reports about the false claims. After they left, Emily sagged into a chair with relief, but I knew it was only another skirmish in what had become an all-out war. Later that afternoon, I spotted Karen parked at the far end of the road in her sedan, binoculars raised as she watched the cabin like some deranged sentry, and instead of confronting her directly, I smiled grimly, because the more she revealed her obsession, the easier it would be to prove she was unfit for any position of authority. Over the next week, she escalated again, filing more bogus complaints, sending contractors to the property claiming they had been hired for repairs, even trying to shut off our electricity by reporting us as non-paying tenants to the utility company. Each attempt I countered with documentation, phone calls, and evidence, and each time her credibility crumbled further. Still, Emily's nerves frayed with each knock at the door, each strange vehicle pulling into the drive, and I did everything I could to keep her calm, reminding her that Karen's desperation was proof we were winning. The turning point came when Richard, my attorney, called one evening to tell me the injunction had been approved by the court, officially barring Karen and the HOA from trespassing or issuing any further notices against my property. I nearly shouted in relief, hugging Emily as I relayed the news, and for the first time in weeks, we felt like we could breathe again. But Karen, as I expected, did not take the court order as a defeat. Instead, she doubled down with open defiance, showing up the very next morning at the fence line with 2 board members, waving her arms and shouting that the injunction was meaningless, that her authority could not be overruled. I walked calmly out to meet her, holding a copy of the court order. And when she tried to grab it from my hand, I pulled it back and told her flatly that every word she spoke was being recorded. The board members shifted uncomfortably, one muttering that they shouldn't be there. And when they left, Karen was forced to follow, her threats trailing behind her like smoke. That evening, Emily and I sat on the porch with the sunset blazing across the lake, and she asked softly if I thought it was finally over. I shook my head, telling her Karen would fight until she destroyed herself, and that all we had to do was make sure we didn't get dragged down with her. What I didn't know then was just how far she was willing to go, and how the battle that had started with paper notices and shouted threats was about to cross into something darker. Something that would test us both in ways we had never imagined. The next day began with an eerie quiet, the kind of silence that presses down on your shoulders and makes you feel like the world is waiting for something terrible to happen. And when I stepped outside to fetch wood for the stove, I noticed tracks cutting across the far edge of the yard that hadn't been there the night before, the marks fresh and deep in the soft soil from the rain, which told me someone had driven close under cover of darkness. Emily joined me, her arms wrapped around herself as she scanned the tracks, and I could see the fear in her eyes even before she whispered, "She's watching us again, isn't she?" I nodded, already feeling the tightness building in my chest. Because Karen had crossed into a new level of obsession now, one that wasn't content with notices and shouting matches, but leaned into intimidation and surveillance. And that was a dangerous place to be. I decided that morning it was time to escalate our own defenses, so I contacted Richard and asked about installing an official no trespass order with the sheriff's office. He agreed it was a wise step, especially given the injunction, and he promised to have the paperwork expedited. By midday, a deputy had come out, shook my hand, and posted the order prominently on the fence posts at the driveway entrance.
Write red letters warning that any entry without permission would lead to immediate arrest.
Emily seemed relieved, but I could tell she was still unsettled, because legal papers only meant something if the other side respected them. And Karen had proven time and again that she respected nothing but her own delusions of power. Sure enough, late that evening, as twilight bled into night and the first stars winked over the lake, I heard the crunch of tires again. I stepped onto the porch with my flashlight, shining it down the drive, and there she was, her sedan idling. Just beyond the sign, headlights glaring like angry eyes. She sat there for a long time, engine humming. And though I couldn't see her face clearly, I could feel her gaze locked onto the cabin. Emily came out beside me, slipping her hand into mine, and together we stood silently waiting. After what felt like an eternity, she finally reversed and drove off, but the message was clear. She wanted us to know she wasn't done. The following day, I decided to take the fight public. I gathered all of the evidence again, this time not for the courtroom but for the community itself. And I crafted a detailed report that included photos, videos, and transcripts of every interaction. Emily helped me design copies, and by evening, we had delivered envelopes to nearly every household around the lake. The response was swift. Neighbors who had once kept their distance began stopping by, offering words of support, sharing their own stories of harassment, even thanking us for standing up to her. Some admitted they had been too afraid to speak out, too worried about retaliation, but seeing our stand gave them courage. It was a turning point, because Karen's power thrived on fear, and now fear was slipping through her fingers. When she realized what we had done, her reaction was explosive. She stormed down our driveway in broad daylight, screaming accusations of slander and defamation, waving a stack of papers she claimed were lawsuits against us. I held up my phone and began recording, calmly asking her to repeat her threats, and when she realized I was filming, she grew even more erratic, her words tumbling over one another as her face turned crimson. Emily stood behind me, strong and unflinching, And I knew in that moment that no matter what Karen threw at us, we weren't facing it alone. That night, after she had retreated once again, I sat by the fire with Emily, feeling a mix of exhaustion and grim determination. The fight had taken so much out of us already, but I also knew we were closer than ever to breaking her grip. The community was shifting, the law was on our side, and her mask was cracking. Still, I couldn't shake the sense that she wasn't finished, that she had one last card to play, one final desperate move to try and destroy us before her empire collapsed. And as I looked out across the dark lake, the water rippling softly under the moonlight, I promised myself that whatever that final move was, we would be ready for it, because there was no turning back now. The morning after her screaming tirade at our driveway, awoke with the uneasy certainty that Karen was plotting something larger, something that went beyond empty threats and fake documents. And as I walked the yard inspecting the property, I noticed faint boot prints near the shed that hadn't been there the day before, half-washed by dew, telling me someone had tried sneaking around in the night. Emily joined me, her face pale as she traced the prints with her eyes. And she whispered that it was only a matter of time before Karen did something reckless enough to land her in jail. I squeezed her hand and told her that reckless was exactly what Karen had become, and reckless people were dangerous. That afternoon, I called Richard and updated him, and he urged me to keep documenting everything while he pushed for contempt charges, explaining that each violation of the injunction strengthened our case. By evening, we were both on edge, the sky heavy with storm clouds, when the sound of approaching engines shattered the quiet again. This time it wasn't just Karen's sedan, it was a convoy of cars, pulling up in a line like some kind of twisted parade. She climbed out at the front, flanked by several board members and even a pair of uniformed men I didn't recognize. And she shouted across the yard that we had 1 hour to vacate the cabin before official action would be taken. Emily gasped, clutching my arm, but I walked forward calmly, holding my phone up to record, demanding to know under what authority she made such a claim. She raised a paper high, yelling about emergency board resolutions. But I called her bluff, telling her to read it aloud for the camera. Her voice faltered, stumbling over the legal jargon, and I pressed harder, asking which judge had signed it, which court had recognized it. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by nervous shuffling among her own people. Then I heard the low rumble of another engine from the road, and moments later the sheriff's cruiser pulled into view, lights flashing. Karen's bravado cracked as the deputies stepped out, asking what was going on, and I handed them my phone with the recording already running. Emily slipped behind me, her shoulders trembling. But I stood firm as the sheriff scanned the bogus paper. Karen clutched, and then turned his hard gaze on her. He told her flatly that the injunction was in effect, that her presence here was a violation, and that if she didn't leave immediately, she would be in handcuffs before sundown. Her face contorted, rage and panic warring as she sputtered about authority and community, but the deputies didn't budge. One of them even turned to me and asked quietly if I wanted to press charges right then. For a long moment I considered it, the weight of every sleepless night, every threat, every act of trespass pressing down, but I decided to wait, telling them instead that the documentation was still building and that when the time came, I wanted the book thrown at her completely. They nodded, warning Karen once more, and she finally retreated, her convoy trailing after her like a defeated army. Emily hugged me tightly once the cruisers were gone, whispering that she couldn't believe it had come this far, and I told her the truth. It wasn't over yet, because Karen wasn't finished, not by a long shot. The next 2 days brought a deceptive calm, no cars in the driveway, no shouting from the fence line, but I had learned to recognize the silence for what it was. On the third night, it broke. Just past midnight, I woke to the acrid scent of smoke, sharp and bitter. And when I rushed to the window, my stomach dropped. The shed was ablaze, flames already climbing high into the dark sky, sparks spitting into the night air. Emily screamed as we rushed outside, and I grabbed the hose, spraying desperately while calling 911. The fire spread fast. Too fast, but by some miracle we managed to keep it from leaping to the cabin until the fire trucks arrived, their sirens wailing down the road. The firefighters battled the blaze until only smoking ruins remained, and one of them pulled me aside. Lowering his voice as he pointed out the clear traces of accelerant in the debris, it hadn't been an accident. It was arson. Emily broke down in tears on the porch while I stood frozen, fury and exhaustion mingling until I could barely breathe. Because in my gut I knew exactly who had done it, even if we didn't have her on camera. When the sheriff arrived to take the report, I handed him every shred of evidence we had gathered, insisting this time that enough was enough, that Karen had crossed the line from harassment to outright criminal violence. He listened carefully, his expression grim, and he promised that the investigation would be thorough. As the last fire truck pulled away and the yard fell silent again, I looked at the smoking rubble of the shed and swore silently that this was the final straw. Karen wanted a war, she was about to get one, and this time it would end in her downfall. The morning after the fire left us raw and exhausted, the cabin filled with the lingering smell of smoke despite the windows we had flung open to clear the air. And Emily sat at the table with red eyes from crying through most of the night, her hands wrapped around a mug she barely touched as she stared out toward the ruins of the shed. I had spent hours cataloging what had been lost: tools, supplies, a few heirlooms I kept stored away, and, though the financial blow was heavy, the deeper wound was the knowledge that someone had invaded our lives with such hate that they would torch what we had built just to frighten us into submission. By midday, the sheriff called to tell me that investigators had confirmed accelerant traces, ruling the fire officially as arson. And though they couldn't yet name a suspect, he assured me that Karen was high on their list. That assurance only partially comforted us, because we knew how slippery she had been, how often she had wriggled out of accountability. But this time we had the weight of law and community finally shifting in our favor. Still, the fear lingered, especially for Emily, who jumped at every sound that night, whispering that she was terrified Karen might try something worse. I pulled her close and promised her that we wouldn't just stand still and wait for it. We would push forward, expose Karen for who she truly was, and make sure she could never wield power over anyone again. Over the following week, Richard filed formal charges on our behalf, stacking them one by one: contempt of court, harassment, intimidation, fraud. And now, arson, while the sheriff's office conducted their own parallel investigation. The neighbors rallied too, showing up with food, with offers to help rebuild the shed, with stories of their own harassment that they were now willing to share publicly. It was as if a dam had broken and the flood of truth could no longer be contained, and Karen's carefully curated image as the iron-fisted HOA leader dissolved under the weight of reality. But she didn't go quietly. On the eve of her court hearing, she staged one final stunt, showing up at the head office with a group of die-hard supporters and delivering a speech about community sovereignty, ranting that the courts had no jurisdiction and that she was being persecuted by enemies of order. Someone filmed it and uploaded it online, and within hours the clip went viral, not as the rousing defense she wanted, but as a humiliating display of delusion. Comments poured in mocking her, calling her out, and even local news picked it up, framing her as the archetypal HOA tyrant who had finally lost control. By the time Emily and I walked into the courtroom the next morning, the tide had completely turned. Karen sat at the defendant's table, looking smaller than I had ever seen her, her hair disheveled, her eyes darting nervously, and when the judge entered and proceedings began, it was clear from the start that her usual tricks wouldn't work here. Richard laid out the mountain of evidence. Witness after witness testified to her harassment. The sheriff's investigator presented findings from the arson scene that tied back to fuel cans discovered in her garage. Karen's voice cracked as she tried to defend herself, blaming conspiracies, accusing everyone of collusion. But the judge cut her off sharply, warning her that continued outbursts would result in removal from the court. Emily sat beside me, her hand gripping mine so tightly her knuckles turned white. And when the verdict was finally read guilty on multiple counts with sentencing to follow, the breath rushed out of her as if she had been holding it for months. I felt a wave of relief, too. Not triumph or gloating, but a deep, exhausted release that justice had at last caught up with her. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, cameras flashing, and when they asked for comment, I kept my words simple. we stood our ground. We told the truth, and the truth won. Back at the cabin that evening, with the sun dipping low across the lake and neighbors gathering to celebrate, Emily leaned against me and whispered that for the first time in months she felt safe. Really safe? And I told her that was all I had wanted from the beginning. Not revenge, not victory, just peace. The shed would be rebuilt, the scars would fade, and Karen's chapter in our lives was finally closed. As the fire crackled in the rebuilt pit and laughter rose around us, I looked out over the water and thought about everything we had endured, and I realized this wasn't just our story, it was a warning to anyone who thought fear and intimidation could rule a community. In the end, it wasn't Karen's power that mattered, it was the courage to stand against it. And to anyone listening, now, to anyone facing their own battle with a bully power, say this: don't back down, document everything, and trust that the truth, though it may take time, will always rise. Because sometimes the only way to defeat a tyrant is to refuse to be afraid. And if you've followed us through every word of this journey, then let me ask you directly, if you want more stories of standing up against the impossible of ordinary, people fighting back and winning, then subscribe now to Sham Stories and never miss what comes next, because you won't believe the battles still to be told.